So in the second lecture of Unit 3, we're going to take a look into the early republic, the creation of the U.S. Constitution, and the creation of new orders throughout the Atlantic world and throughout North America. Because it was not only the United States that was a new nation at this time. Many Native American nations developed their consolidated power at the time and developed their own governance structures. Um, and there were other very important revolutions in the Atlantic world. You had the establishment of the first Black Republic with the overthrow of both French colonialism and slavery in Haiti. And then, of course, you had the French Revolution, which reverberated around the world as one of the most important revolutions, really, in all of world history. And all of this affected the history of North America and why the 1800s in North America developed the way they did. So we'll have three goals of this class today. So first, I want you to be able to understand the creation of the Constitution and the historical debates about slavery in the Constitution. Was the Constitution pro-slavery? Was it anti-slavery? Was it something in between? Is there a more complicated story to tell here? Next, I want you to be able to conceptualize the many revolutions that happened in North America in the late 1700s. Because again, I think they're vital to understand how history developed in North America in the early 1800s. Because the 1800s would not be a time of European colonial empires in North America. Those were broken by the United States and were also broken by many different native nations gaining power and overthrowing Spanish and French authority in west of the Mississippi. And then lastly, I want you to be able to explain U.S. politics during the early republic. Because all these different revolutions, including the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, profoundly impacted U.S. politics and the reasons why the United States adopted sort of different courses of action towards the institution of slavery and also towards how aggressive U.S. settler colonialism would be in the West. So first, it's important to mention that the Constitution was actually not the first governing document that governed the United States. That was the Articles of Confederation. And that was actually set up during the end of the American Revolutionary War. And so the Articles of Confederation, however, had many problems. In essence, the Articles treated each state as its own independent republic, which could print its own money and levy its own taxes. Um, and the legislature was by far the most powerful entity in the Articles. So there wasn't actually much executive power under the Articles of Confederation. You know, today we have a president, and the president wields enormous power in the United States. Under the Articles of Confederation, the executive branch really couldn't do a whole lot or much of anything. The legislature had all of the power. And part of the reason for that is because at the time, Americans were very distrustful of centralized authority. They were worried about being ruled by a tyrant, ruled by a king. And so what's the best possible way to prevent rule by a king? Don't have a king. Don't, don't have a powerful president. And so the Articles gave all the power to the legislature. Even then, though, the legislature did not have that much power. And that's because of the way it was set up. So one of the things political scientists often talk about when they examine governments is how many veto points do you have in the political system? And what they mean by veto points is what sort of different individuals in government can hold up things from happening. Well, the Articles of Confederation had a lot of veto points. It was very easy to stop laws from being passed or government from doing things. And again, this is because American colonists were very paranoid of central authority at the time. And so despite the fact that the legislature was by far the most powerful entity under the Articles of Confederation, in the legislature, on most items, um, each state actually had a veto. So all 13 states often had to agree for a law to be passed, which actually prevented much from getting done because in the end, what connected a large-scale plantation economy, slave society in South Carolina to, for instance, the small state of Rhode Island, which was basically just kind of like a small port town, right? These states did not have a whole lot in common, so it was going to be very difficult to get large states, small states, states with significant investment in slavery as an institution, and states with almost no investment with slavery as an institution. It's going to be difficult to get them all to agree, right? And so that had a lot of different consequences. So as states started issuing their own currencies, economic problems really beset the United States. As different economic issues started hurting state economies, and um, the Articles of Confederation also lacked the power of taxation. So revenue could not be raised at the federal level to help states deal with their debts from the Revolutionary War or to deal with economic recessions or economic depressions. It also did not help that newly independent Americans resented the levying of any taxes. As mentioned, these states had significant debts from the Revolutionary War. And so this actually led to a lot of different conflicts in states. So the state of Massachusetts actually levied a bunch of taxes on Massachusetts farmers who are already dealing with a lot of debt. And so this actually led to a major rebellion, an armed rebellion against the state of Massachusetts, when Daniel Shea and a Massachusetts farmer and other farmers actually tried to break into state armories and openly revolt against the state. And this revolt had to be put down by the state militia. Um, the last sort of big problem with the Articles of Confederation is if the federal government can't levy taxes and can't actually raise money, they can't make an army. And there was a real fear by many middle class and upper class Americans um, that France or Britain might come back and attack the United States. And perhaps maybe even Britain might even come back and try to reestablish its colonies on the North American mainland. And if the United States couldn't raise an army to defend themselves, um, it could be a real risk for the country. And so the Articles of Confederation, while they preserve the goals of many Americans to restrict centralized authority, really ran into a lot of problems that led to sort of a crisis moment in the late 1780s. So in 1787, a number of elite men, or men who were fairly rich and fairly prominent in society, sort of came together and said that there needed to be a new constitutional convention, and that each state should send delegates to this constitutional convention to help amend the Articles of Confederation and address those big flaws with the Articles. And it's worth mentioning that the Constitutional Convention drew people who wanted to change the Articles of Confederation. There was a substantial minority in the United States that was happy with the way the Articles of Confederation functioned. They may have not been happy with the outcomes in terms of how well the economy was doing, or sort of the sort of chaos caused by stuff like Shays' Rebellion, but they were still mainly concerned about a tyrannical government, right? So they didn't want to strengthen the government. But this constitutional convention drew people who really wanted to sort of change the federal government and make it stronger. And so a group of delegates from all the 13 states arrived and met in Philadelphia, um, in downtown Philadelphia in 1787 to amend the Articles of Confederation. And quite quickly, all the delegates decide the Articles of Confederation isn't worth saving. We are just going to scrap it and rewrite the entire Constitution. And they do this under kind of secretly. They don't allow the public into these meetings, right? And so after the Constitution is sort of decided, there are, many of its opponents kind of accuse this of being not a legitimate political process, as more like a coup. And that's not entirely true. States were on board with sending delegates to amend the Articles of Confederation, but there's a sort of a kernel of truth to it. So one of the first speeches that is given is by Alexander Hamilton, who is a delegate from New York State. And Alexander Hamilton is a more sort of pro-British American representative. He was definitely more sort of a moderate revolutionary, and he wants a very strong federal government. And so Alexander Hamilton gives this speech that today we would almost kind of find a little bit shocking. So Hamilton presents his plan for this new federal government. He says that the president can be elected, but should be elected for life. So you choose your president maybe once every, 40 years, 50 years, depends how old the president is, right, when they're elected. But he said specifically that it was going to be more likely to prevent tyranny if you had a president for life, like Great Britain's king, than if you had a president only serve, say, 7 years. And then he argued that senators should also be elected for life. So you have a president elected for life, and you have senators elected for life. While he argued that the president and senators should be elected through proportional representation, he also says that they should actually be elected not directly through direct elections. So today in the United States, we technically vote for electors who then vote for the president. In reality, state laws have changed so that electors always will just certify the vote of whatever the state voted for, right? So we're basically directly electing presidents nowadays. But Alexander Hamilton argued not only you're going to vote first for electors, and then those electors are then going to vote for different electors, and then those electors will vote for president and senate. So it was not only not direct democracy, it was almost sort of aristocratic. And then the last thing that Hamilton calls for is he argues that state governors should be actually appointed by the federal government. And this would have been outrageous to your average American citizen who state governors at the time were some of the most prominent political institutions, and having the ability to vote in or vote a state governor out of office is incredibly important for Americans at the time. So this sort of idea of sort of massive federal control over state affairs would have been very radical. And the sort of only check on the presidency besides the Supreme Court would have been that the president could be impeached. And so Hamilton said, well, no, this isn't like a king because the president can be impeached. So it's not a big deal. Kind of the shocking thing is that a sort of prominent American historian looked back at Hamilton's speech and tried to figure out how is this speech received by the delegates at the Constitution, at the Constitutional Convention. And kind of the shocking thing is the delegates kind of receive it in sort of a ho-hum kind of way. They almost accept it. They say, well, that's a wonderful idea on paper. Yeah, we'd happily support your incredibly centralized federal government that basically elects a monarch for life. But the people aren't going to buy it. So we'll keep discussing and find something that the people will support. And I told this whole story just to really emphasize that the group of people who went to the Constitutional Convention were much more anti-democratic than your average American citizen at the time. And if left to their own devices, might have actually designed a fairly anti-democratic government. But they felt responsible to the people, and there was also a group of legislators, including James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who did want a more representative system. So I think this question of democracy is really important as to, you know, were the framers of the Constitution being wholly democratic in designing it? And the sort of complicated and quite unsettling answer is perhaps not. But their goal, again, was to form an effective federal government that could actually solve the problems of the Articles of Confederation. So, um, quickly, however, delegates began working on looking at the major issues of what would form the national government. And so they had a variety of different proposals for the legislature. You probably heard about these in high school history, so we don't necessarily need to go over them. But larger, you had larger states like Virginia want more proportional representation so that population would count more for elections. You wanted smaller states like Rhode Island to have something more like the modern day Senate, which would allow states to have an equal say, just like they did in the Articles of Confederation. And they chose a balanced system and a compromise where you would have a House proportionally elected and a Senate where states had equal representation, right? Um, so that was sort of established. And then there was also a larger issue about the presidency, and there was a lot of questions about the presidency because the presidency was something that concerned a lot of different delegates. They were worried about a tyrant taking control of the country and ruling, like, for instance, the British monarch. Never mind, again, that actually Parliament had the majority of the power in Britain, but these were the fears that were sort of on their minds. And so they wanted to make a system with lots of different checks and balances on the executive. Um, and while trying to figure out how to do that, how to balance the different powers of the different branches of government, um, they actually drew on a variety of different sources. So one of those sources was Enlightenment thinkers. And so at the time, the Enlightenment was sort of a philosophical movement involving lots of different philosophers throughout the world and especially in Europe. And so one of their thinkers that they were very interested in were the ideas of Montesquieu, and Montesquieu believed in the separation of powers, and the separation of powers was basically an idea that different parts of the government should check each other's power. And so James Madison especially read Montesquieu and wanted to implement his idea of separation of power. Um, and so this is why in the federal government you have actually lots of different checks on each other. So, for instance, the president can veto a law passed by the Senate and the House. But the Senate and the House, with a two-thirds majority, can overrule the president. And so that's sort of a double check that the executive and legislature have over each other. Um, and and also many presidential appointments required Senate approval, and many treaties required Senate approval as well. Whereas all the funding agreements, all budget uh, laws had to begin in the House of Representatives. And so each of these different branches had different powers. The judiciary is a much more complicated thing that we do not have time to get into, so I'll leave it at that. However, there was no sort of example of how such a system was supposed to work in the real world, because remember, most of Europe at the time was filled with monarchies. There were very few republics and almost no democracies in the world. One very interesting democracy that was fairly nearby, the United States, however, was that of the Iroquois Confederacy, which had a system of government that was at its core quite democratic. And at its core, also used the idea of separation of powers in their own sort of way and with their own sort of thought. So um, as you'll remember, the Iroquois Confederacy was made up of 5 different nations, eventually 6 when another nation joins them. But it was the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, and Onondaga. So the way the Iroquois Confederacy worked is the Mohawk and Seneca which were two large nations that were on the edges of the Iroquois Confederacy. The Mohawk was on the east, the Seneca was on the west. The Mohawk and Seneca had to first agree on a proposal. Then that proposal went to Cayuga and Oneida, and the Cayuga and Oneida had to agree on that proposal. And then finally, the proposal was sent to the representatives of the Onondaga, and the Onondaga got the final say as to whether the proposal would be passed. And so you could actually have something passed with the Mohawk and Seneca agreeing on one thing and the Onondaga agreeing on another, or the Cayuga and Oneida agreeing on one item and the Onondaga agreeing on another. And so it's a form of government that ensured that at least three different nations of the five nations would support the eventual, whatever proposal was going to be passed in the Iroquois Confederacy. The other interesting thing is they had a lot of other different checks on power. So you might have had chiefs or who were sent to the council fire, and this was what they often called their legislative body, in order to make decisions for the Iroquois Confederacy. But these chiefs could actually be removed by the clan mothers, by the matriarchs of the villages and of these different nations. And so women actually had a very important say in how the government was run, which is something the United States, of course, didn't have until the 20th century, and has never had. Women have never had that degree of power in the United States. And so, however, this system, while it's quite different from the system of the government that the that the delegates of the Constitutional Convention came up with, it did show very clearly how a system of separation of powers might practically work in a republic and in a democracy. And what's fascinating is actually the diaries and the notes of the delegates of the Constitutional Convention show that they were thinking about this. John Adams actually has very detailed notes on how the Iroquois Confederacy functioned. And so all of this was sort of taken into account when they were sort of forming what this new government would look like. One crucial question that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had to deal with was that of slavery, because because the Articles of Confederation was so weak, the question of slavery really never came up. You didn't have a powerful federal government that could really get in the way of states deciding different laws regarding race-based chattel slavery. And so, at the end of the American Revolution, you had some states that decided to do away with slavery. And we talked about in the previous lecture how Massachusetts ended up abolishing slavery by judicial fiat. And a bunch of other states in the North, including Pennsylvania, and then eventually New York and Connecticut and New Jersey, as well as Rhode Island, all abolish slavery or at least set up gradual emancipation plans that decrease the number of people enslaved in those states. But suddenly, with a powerful federal government that could actually make and enforce laws under this new constitution, the question of slavery became a lot more important, because the federal government could decide on laws that would affect how slavery as an institution would function in this republic. And so it was definitely a topic that was debated at the Constitutional Convention, and what came out of it was something that was a little bit mixed, something that sort of pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides could argue favored their position. So, was the Constitution a pro-slavery document? Historians recently have actually argued this question vehemently. On one hand, the Constitution never explicitly mentioned slavery as an institution. It did not actually codify that human beings could be held as property. And that was a major win for anti-slavery delegates. Historian Sean Wilentz found that anti-slavery delegates specifically tried to make sure that the Constitution never formally codified slavery, and allow a sort of legal opening for anti-slavery forces in the future to attack slavery as an institution that was incompatible with the Constitution. On the other hand, though, there were specific compromises that gave pro-slavery forces significant power in this new federal government. So there was the Three-Fifths Compromise, which gave greater representative power to planters in slave states. Now, the Three-Fifths Clause stated that an enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation in the House of Representatives. As enslaved people could not vote, this was a huge boon for voters in slave states who wanted to preserve slavery because their votes would have more power. So it was anti-slavery forces in the Constitutional Convention who were actually arguing that no, people who can't vote shouldn't get represented in Congress because otherwise that's giving more power to the voters of states where slavery is a huge institution. And then lastly, the Constitution allowed the continuance of the Atlantic slave trade until 1808. And on the face of it, this looks like a very pro-slavery clause. In the Constitution, it specifically says the federal government cannot abolish the transatlantic slave trade, that horrible institution we talked about a couple of lectures ago, until 1808. But in the reality, the clause actually didn't really greatly affect the institution of slavery, because by the late 1700s, there was already a natural increase in the enslaved population. And so the transatlantic slave trade was actually unnecessary to continue to expand slavery in the United States. So while this Constitution was not explicitly pro-slavery, it definitely preserved some legal remedies for anti-slavery forces to argue against the Constitution later on in the 1800s. Nonetheless, a strong argument can be made that its provisions gave slave states important protections from federal government interference and actually increased their power in the legislature. And in our next lecture, where we will actually talk about how the institution of slavery sort of intertwined with American politics and the importance of the Three-Fifths Compromise and the Three-Fifths Clause in increasing the power of states where slavery was a major institution. Now, as Americans were debating this new Constitution in Philadelphia and redesigning the United States government, similar processes were actually happening in Native nations in the West. So one group of people who lived in the United States, not in the United States, sorry, in North America around this time, was that of the Muskogee Nation, or people who are called today the Creek Nation. And the Creek Nation lived around modern-day eastern Alabama and western Georgia, and they were a prominent power, actually, in the Southwest. And so, as the United States was trying to figure out its governmental system, Creek leaders were also actually forging a new government and creating a Creek Confederacy with stronger federal powers. And so, the Creek Nation at the time was located in the western part of modern-day Georgia. And the fledgling state of Georgia, which at the time was a really small state, one of the smallest states in the United States, was actually fighting against the Creeks in the 1780s and trying to expand into Creek lands. And so, in response to this threat, Creek leaders actually began to try to consolidate the huge amount of different towns and villages in the Creek Nation, and consolidate into a more nationalist government that could defend themselves. And just like the United States at the time was trying to create a stronger federal union to defend themselves from foreign powers. So one prominent member of the Creek Confederacy was a man by the name of Alexander McGillivray. And he was the son of a Creek mother of prominent lineage in the Creek Confederacy, and a Scottish trader who had traded with different Creek villages in the 1700s. And so Alexander McGillivray sought to bring together different Creek towns into a confederacy and a nationalist government that would resist U.S. encroachment. And so he successfully consolidated power in newly created councils that overruled actually small village governments. And traditionally in Creek politics, villages individually would decide their affairs. So one village might, for instance, ally with the British, another village might trade with the French, another village might make agreements with, for instance, American missionaries. So each village could kind of decide what was in their best interests. But Alexander McGillivray's councils started overruling these village authorities and consolidating political power in a centralized government. And this was actually a huge change in gender relations as well. Because Creeks were matrilineal, Creek women had significant power in Creek villages and in these village councils. But these newly created councils were actually primarily male. And so it was men who actually, who often had also adopted more Americanized practices and even started adopting sort of patriarchal American views, who tried to overrule the power of women in these newly created councils. And were able to successfully do so. And that was not only because they took legislative authority, but like in the Constitution, these councils took executive authority. So McGillivray was actually able to establish a Creek police force, which would go to different villages and enforce these council rules. And so McGillivray ended up having support of a lot more Creeks who were more assimilating into white American culture, and this also included adopting white American habits and social mores, including like adopting the institution of chattel slavery and adopting plantation culture. And so you begin to see in the late 1700s and especially in the early 1800s, many in the Creek Nation, wealthy Creek men start actually engaging in the slave trade and buying enslaved peoples to work cotton and tobacco plantations. And so this creates sort of a really very different dynamic that really changes traditional Creek society, which was again focused on agriculture for the most part, and agriculture to feed yourself, not agriculture creating cash crops. Yet, despite the fact that these members of the Creek Nation were sort of more Americanized, they were dead set against American expansion. And sure enough, this new centralized government was actually able to stop land sales to individual members in the state of Georgia, and it was actually more able to effectively defend Creek territory. And so, using firearms provided by the Spanish in Florida, as the Spanish still had their colony of Florida, McGillivray actually initiated a war against the state of Georgia in 1786, right as the Constitution was being debated and discussed. And so the delegates at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia distributed their draft for a new government, and it had to go to the states to be ratified. And the Constitution needed to be ratified by 9 out of the 13 states in order to go into effect and take the place of the Articles of Confederation. And states agreed to this process. And so it was debated actually in lots of different states all around the country. And in fact, one of the places where the Constitution was very quickly ratified was that of Georgia. Because Georgia was a small state that did not have much power, and normally such a state might sort of resent the creation of a strong federal government. But Georgia was worried about the Spanish in Florida and was worried about this war that the Creek Nation just launched against it in order for the Creek Nation to preserve their territory. And so Georgia desperately needed a federal army to and funds from a centralized federal government to come and help and defend their state against the Creek Nation. And so that's why historians suspect that Georgia actually quickly ratified the Constitution. But I want to sort of linger on this Georgia example because I actually think it's quite interesting. History is an imperfect science. It's an imperfect field. And one fascinating thing about Georgia ratification is we actually have no documents, no diaries, no memoirs about why Georgia ratified the Constitution. We know nothing. Historians have sort of connected these two, the Creek War against Georgia and constitutional ratification, and historians speculate that that's the reason why Georgia ratified the Constitution. But that's just going off of the available evidence we have, which is very, very little. And so, you'd be surprised. There are many things in history where we actually don't have a whole lot of evidence about why something happened. And historians have to sort of connect the dots and connect small pieces of evidence to sort of figure out what actually happened in the past. So I just wanted to linger on that because I think that's sort of really important to know about how history is created and how we know what we know, right? So nonetheless, Georgia is one of the first states to ratify the Constitution. And New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania each follow and ratify the Constitution. But quickly after those 4 states ratify the Constitution, there's the constitutional ratification actually hits a bit of a wall. And state delegates in a bunch of different states are actually greatly divided over whether to adopt the Constitution. And so and one of the reasons for that is because many of the Constitution's opponents worried about the possibility of a powerful executive. Remember, Americans had just revolted against the British, and they worried about the sort of power of George of the British king at the time. And so they were very worried about a powerful executive. And sure enough, the Constitution did endow the presidency with lots of different powers. And ties between the Senate and the president also concerned delegates. They worried that since the Senate was the main check on the presidency, if the Senate could be packed with allies of the president, you might actually have sort of a cabal that was formed and a significant sort of entrenchment of power in the Senate and the presidency that could work against the interests of the nation. And so some states chose to ratify the Constitution only because they did not want to be left behind actually under the new Constitution. And so when news of New Hampshire's ratification came through, New York delegates who originally opposed the Constitution were probably going to vote against it, actually agreed to vote for it, knowing that they lost their leverage to demand changes to the text. And many of these states actually sought to pass things that were not just like a simple ratification, but they almost wanted to pass amendments to the Constitution and say those amendments had to be passed before they would ratify. But nonetheless, eventually, state by state does sort of eventually come around and ratify the Constitution. And so the North Carolina is actually one state that votes against the Constitution and then comes back and actually ends up ratifying it. And you can actually see on these maps here the different ratification maps and how different areas in different states voted. If you look at the one on the on your left here of North Carolina, you'll notice that the vast majority of North Carolina actually refuses to ratify the Constitution in their first convention. And you'll also notice a trend. Western counties tend to oppose the Constitution, while eastern counties and more wealthy areas with larger cities and that have sort of an older presidents tend to support ratification of the Constitution. And so you'll see North Carolina, a lot of the old planting areas supported the Constitution because these were wealthier people who would benefit from having a stronger federal government, whereas western areas mostly opposed it. And similarly, in New York City itself actually supports the Constitution because remember, New York City was a place of significant commerce, and they actually want to do sort of regular business with nations abroad, and would actually appreciate a federal government that could better regulate trade and ensure sort of a free flow of commerce instead of having the sort of economic basket case that the United States was under the Articles of Confederacy. But your average farmers in upstate New York were actually much more concerned about the powers that the Constitution would endow in the federal government because remember you had Shays' Rebellion where the state of Massachusetts gave put a lot of taxes on farmers, and so New York farmers and other farmers in western areas of states were very much worried that this new federal government with greater taxation powers might levy a bunch of taxes on them and hurt their livelihoods. But nonetheless, the Constitution, through this sort of state by state battles, is eventually ratified. Now, one of the reasons why ratification actually goes through is because there are promises made by supporters of the Constitution to people who oppose it that they were going to draft a Bill of Rights and pass a set of 10 amendments to the Constitution that would ensure the rights of people against a new powerful federal government. And that's something actually that's very important to know, is that the Constitution originally did not have the Bill of Rights. Originally, the document just gave a bunch of powers to a new federal government, and there were no rights that were given to the citizens. And it's only through opposition against the Constitution that the Bill of Rights is created. And so, you think in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of peaceful assemblies, freedom to protest, right? These are things that the original Constitution did not have in it. And so that's really important to understand, is that it's through this debate, these ratification debates between people who oppose the Constitution and people who support it, that you actually get a much more representative document that actually, at least on paper, vows to protect the rights of individual citizens. And without the forces opposed to the Constitution, you would not have had a Bill of Rights. You would not have had freedom of speech established in the First Amendment. You wouldn't have the right to habeas corpus, the right to a free and fair trial, the right against cruel and unusual punishment. These were all things that were established due to opposition to the original document. So, in fact, the ratification of the Constitution in itself was almost a compromise. And it was a compromise between people supporting the Constitution and people against the Constitution that drew a balance between a stronger federal government and a government that also, at least again on paper, protected the rights of citizens. Now, one very important thing that the United States government did, both under actually the Articles of Confederation and under the Constitution, there's actually a fairly unified policy, was to commit to settler colonialism as a strategy. Early U.S. politicians and leaders of this new republic very much imagined expanding their borders west and taking the lands of Native American nations. And this was not an accident. This was absolutely intended by people at the time, by Americans at the time. So if you'll remember, one of the causes of the American Revolution itself was the Proclamation Act of 1763, when the British government specifically told American colonists, you cannot go past this line because we don't want you squatting on on the land of native nations, and we don't want you stealing land, because if you start stealing land, you're going to start a war. And if you start a war, that's going to cost a lot of money. Well, the early United States kind of throws it out the window, and the early United States firmly commits to expanding their borders. And that means wars. And that means wars against native nations. And one key reason we know this, and this was something that historians have only begun to recently sort of acknowledge and even recently study, is that the main way that that U.S. politicians thought that the federal government would be funded is actually through land sales. And so their idea was that the U.S. Army would go out, conquer native nations, make treaties with these native nations to take a lot of their land, and then take this land, create military districts out of this land, and then sell this land to private investors, to land companies, who would then sell this land to American settlers. And this is how the federal government would fund itself. It would fund itself through warfare, through taking native land and turning it into new land for the United States. And how would this new land be organized? Well, ideally, this new land would be organized into new states. And in fact, there were processes set up by the United States to create new Western states. And this was after sort of a big debate between people, because certain American politicians were very worried that essentially you would have the eastern states would actually start to create their own colonies. There's no reason why there had to be a process set up to create new states. You could have just had Virginia expand west, and what the state that we know today as Kentucky could have been just the colony of Virginia. Ohio could have been a colony of Pennsylvania. There was nothing preventing that from happening except for the ideology of Americans themselves. Americans themselves did not want to live in an empire. They wanted to live in a republic. And so through these processes, they convinced themselves that no, they're democratic. They're going to create new states. They're going to create new societies where people are going to be citizens. And that does matter. Even if the sort of idea of expanding the country's borders and engaging in military conquest and setting up new colonies, settler colonies, is colonialism, despite the fact they don't want to call it that, right? And so effectively, the United States in the 1780s and 1790s was setting up new ways to be something of an empire. Though again, they would not like the people at the time would not like to have used that term, right? But these were the sort of processes that were created. And in particular, colonists at the time looked at a couple of key areas. So states in the South, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, were really eyeing land in the West, in the Southwest, and specifically the land of the Cherokee, of the Creek, of the Chickasaw, of these huge native nations in what is in modern day Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, which had a lot of these nations had a lot of fertile land that would be excellent for cotton growing, and we'll talk about that in our next lecture. Um, but states in the north also coveted land in where we are today in Ohio. And this region of Ohio was populated by the Lenape, by the Miami, by the Shawnee, um, by major Native American nations with dozens of settlements and cities here in Ohio, and was on some of the richest agricultural land in North America. And so uh, Americans from all these different eastern states had reasons to support the processes of settler colonialism and expansion against Native American nations. And this was written in to how the United States would function as a country in the 1780s and 1790s. The U.S. depended upon money from these land sales to actually fund its operations. So it's really important to understand how this was a crucial component of the early American Republic. And so in the 1790s, the United States actually sought to conquer where we're living now, the modern state of Ohio, which was populated by many Native American nations who lived in multi-ethnic villages, including the Lenape, the Odawa, the Wyandot, the Shawnee, and the Miami. And these different Native American nations actually saw the Americans as a powerful threat, and formed an alliance against U.S. expansion to defend their territory. And this was the same sort of alliance that was actually built up and formed by Pontiac, the Odawa leader, who resisted the British in 1763 and actually expelled the British from a lot of the modern day Great Lakes regions. And so this same group of people again formed an alliance against U.S. aggression, and two prominent leaders helped to form this alliance. Little Turtle, who was a prominent leader of the Miami people, and Blue Jacket, who was a leader of the Shawnee, who lived in modern-day southern Ohio. And this force under Little Turtle and Blue Jacket actually did successfully resist a U.S. army that was sent into Ohio in the early 1790s, and actually won a major battle against this army and destroyed a good portion of it. And this army was forced to retreat back east. This army wasn't actually was not a professional army. It was sort of a ragtag group of individuals that was led by a person named General St. Clair. And it was this defeat that actually convinced Congress that they need to form and build a professional army to actually fight back against this alliance and successfully take over Ohio. And again, it's worth mentioning that this group of native leaders, all they were seeking to do was defend their land. They had signed multiple treaties with the United States that confirmed the Ohio River as the boundary between American settlement and the land of these native nations. And American settlers were consistently violating this treaty. There were people who were coming from Kentucky and squatting on native land, and engaging in random massacres against Native Americans in southern Ohio. And so this was a defensive alliance. But as I previously discussed, the United States was committed to settler colonialism and committed to expansion. And so the Congress allocated a significant amount of money to create a professional army that was led by General Anthony Wayne. And this professional army again comes back into Ohio in the 1790s, and confronts this alliance under Little Turtle and Blue Jacket at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And in this particular battle, the battle's almost kind of fought to a draw, with eventually the native force retreating, but not taking significant casualties. But the key thing was that this group, this native force, did suffer a good amount of casualties, and it was enough to convince many native nations to come to a negotiated agreement with the United States. Because remember, this was a multicultural alliance across several different nations, all of whom were led by lots of different people. And so, while there was a group that wanted to continue fighting against Anthony Wayne's army, many decided to negotiate with the United States. And what was negotiated was the Treaty of Greenville, which you can see on this map here. And if you'll see this dark line around northern Ohio right here, um, every all the land east and south of this line was taken by the United States, and the U.S. and U.S. settlers began establishing towns in this area. Um, and the area of northwestern Ohio was preserved by these native nations, and so many of them moved to the area around modern day Toledo, which was at the time actually a huge wetlands. It will only later be drained by American settlers in the mid 1800s, and it was sort of a very rich farming land. And so many native nations moved into this area, and were able to preserve, at least this portion of land to live on in modern day Ohio. But that was not to last for very long, only around 15 or so years. And so eventually, by forming a professional army, the United States is able to take over a good portion of Ohio. So, as the United States is debating the Constitution and establishing a new form of government, um, other areas out west also have their own sort of revolutions. And so, the Comanches, a group of Native Americans who lived in modern day eastern Colorado, um, are actually able to not necessarily revolt, but kind of reshape the order of Spanish New Mexico and of of the Spanish colonies in North America. And so the Comanches, through their use and adoption of horses, are actually able to successfully start an incredibly powerful reading economy, where they hunt buffalo throughout the Great Plains. They use buffalo hides, and all parts of the buffalo, to gain wealth. And then they actually do these huge raids, cavalry raids, into Spanish New Mexico and all the way down almost near Mexico City and down to places like modern day Monterey. Um, and they attack Spanish ranches, uh, are able to take cattle, steal horses, and destroy many Spanish towns, and including in modern day Texas as well. And so the adoption of the horse and the use of firearms on horseback makes the Comanches an incredibly powerful nation in the West. And so, right as the United States is emerging in the East as this new republic, the Comanches are greatly expanding their power over the Great Plains and actually kind of leading to the um, uh, the deterioration of Spanish power in North America. And so you have this period of not only kicking the British out on the east, but Also, Native American nations successfully establishing larger and more powerful political entities in the West that kick out or reduce the power of colonial powers. Um, and lastly, as a quick note, it's around this time where Louisiana is actually purchased by the United States, and you have this great new land that the U.S. is going to explore, and they supposedly own, and Lewis and Clark go and try to figure out what they just got. The answer is they didn't get anything. The French, the Spanish don't own these areas. These larger, powerful native nations do. And so there's a peak fiction with the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase doesn't really matter. It's kind of a purchase for the right to conquer, right? But America at this time, in 1800, is not going to conquer the Comanche Empire. Which is expanding its power in the early 1800s. It's only after the Civil War that the United States is able to really push west with the full force of a sort of newly created massive federal military. And so we really have to understand the Louisiana Purchase is almost like a fiction. It doesn't actually show who actually controlled this territory, and the Comanches controlled a good deal of it. Another nation that greatly increased their power around this time was that of the Lakota. So the Lakota, for a long time, had lived in around modern day Minnesota, Minneapolis, and a little bit west of there. Um, but again, just like the Comanches, once the Lakota actually adopt um, horses as an important raiding tool and hunting tool, they move to the Great Plains, and the Lakota find a sort of a very interesting place, that of the Black Hills, and the Black Hills are is almost this mountain range in modern day western South Dakota that has increased rainfall and is a place that has access to a lot of the sort of hunting grounds of the Great Plains and those great buffalo herds, but also has um, good water supply and a good place to be protected from strong winter storms. And so the Lakota find the Black Hills around the time of the American Revolution, around the 1770s, and relocate a lot of their villages there. And one of the places they find is a place called Thumkasila Shakpe, or the Six Grandfathers. And this is a set of mountains in the Black Hills that will eventually be taken from the United States and turned into Mount Rushmore. Um, and so uh, this becomes sort of a very important sacred site for the Lakota Nation. And as using their base in the Black Hills, the Lakota are able to dominate the northern Great Plains. And so while you have the Comanche on the southern Great Plains and around modern day Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, eastern Colorado, on the northern Great Plains, you have the Lakota. Um, and these two large equestrian native polities really sort of centralized and become very powerful native nations by the late 1700s. And it's worth mentioning that Thumkashila Shakpe um, and the whole region of the Black Hills, the United States agreed in 1980 Supreme Court case called the United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians that this land was actually stolen by the United States illegally in the late 1800s. And At the time, the judge rewarded several $100 million to be paid to modern day Lakota tribal nations. The Lakota refused this payment and they're demanding their land back. Um, the the this The payment was actually put in and invested, and now this payment is around $1 billion. And the Lakota still refuse this money and ask for their actual land back from the United States. And so, this still has relevance to us today. These disputes and this larger history is important for us to understand today. So another native nation in the West that actually gained a lot of power around this time was that of the Osage, or as they call themselves, the Wasatch. And the Osage lived in modern-day southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, kind of in between the area around the Ozark Mountains and the Ouachita Mountains in the west, and the Mississippi River in the east. And this sort of hilly terrain often had actually lots of great hunting grounds. And so, like the Comanches and like the Lakota, the Osage actually adopted horses as both a hunting um, and a raiding and military tool. And this sort of mass adoption of horses by this pretty large and populous people um, in around this area of the Arkansas River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley, um, they were actually able to greatly expand their territory and their area of effective control in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And this was very important because while this area between sort of French Louisiana um, and ostensibly U.S. territory east of the Mississippi, but honestly, it's actually controlled by lots of different other native nations. Um, this area was kind of went between a lot of different people, colonial powers at the time. So the French had it for a little bit, the Spanish take it over for a while, and then the French are able to regain it. And this is part of the Louisiana Purchase that I had previously mentioned that eventually the United States gets a hold of in the early 1800s. Um, but this region isn't really controlled by any colonial powers, so it doesn't really matter whether the French arguably control it or the Spanish or the United States. The reality is that the Osage at this time were able to exercise significant control over the commerce on the Mississippi River, and effectively, if you wanted to trade here, you would not trade. You would not be able to trade with other native nations. You'd have to trade with the Osage, and the Osage actually uh, establish a monopoly on commerce on the Mississippi, because if independent traders, either French or American or Spanish, tried to trade with other native nations who were rivals of the Osage, like for instance the Quapaw or the Wichita or the Illinois. The Osage would basically figure out who was conducting these trades and attack them and kill them. And so the Osage was basically like, you trade with us or you trade with no one. And they effectively enforced this quite well in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And so, like the Comanche and like the Lakota, what you see in the late 1700s is sort of native polities gaining significant power in the trans-Mississippian West. And so this time period was not a time of unfettered U.S. expansion. It was a time of European colonial empires degrading all throughout the North American continent. The British losing their colonies on the Atlantic coast, the French losing their colonies in the center part of the country, and then the Spanish suffering significant Comanche raids that prevent them from controlling the western part of North America as well. So the U.S. is sort of a newly emerging republic and revolutionary nation, and the Osage and the Comanches and the Lakota are also strong, new growing nations around this time. And so we should really see North America as almost undergoing the sort of collapse of colonial empires in the late 1700s throughout the continent. And so as you have these revolutions out west, you also have arguably the most important revolution in the history of the world, that of the French Revolution, when the French people revolt and overthrow their monarchy and establish a new republic on the basis of not only like political equality but also economic equality, which is a little bit different from that of the American Revolution, where the questions of political equality were a little bit more important, and you had more elites involved in the American Revolution than the French Revolution. And the French Revolution really divides um, American politicians because you had a group of American politicians who uh, built a political party of that called the Federalists, and the Federalists supported a strong centralized government, a strong banking institution, um, and was perhaps a little bit more pro-British than pro-French. They wanted to create a United States that was actually a little bit more like the British Empire, ironically enough. And the Federalists also had a lot of support from American Revolutionary War veterans and people who fought for the Continental Army. Meanwhile, Republicans supported uh, more supported the French and more saw the country as a place of a nation of small farmers where individual liberties would be protected and people would be protected not only from centralized political power but also centralized economic power. Republicans were very worried about um, mercantile interests and uh, people like bankers and merchants and large business owners. And so this is kind of how the division in American politics worked. And the French Revolution kind of threw almost like a firebomb into early American politics as Republicans sort of very much supported the French Revolution. They thought it was a great thing. People were fighting for economic equality and overthrowing an empire and a monarchy. This is a wonderful thing. And whereas Federalists were a lot more worried because, again, the French Revolution threatened economic monopolization and economic power in a way that they weren't fully comfortable with. Um, and so this actually led to a lot of conspiracy theories in the New Republic, as Federalists would accuse their Republican opposition as being supportive of uh, chaos and anarchy and of kind of creating these images that Republican leaders, if they gain control, will bring out a guillotine in the middle of Philadelphia and start killing merchants and stuff like they did in France, right, during the Reign of Terror. Um, Meanwhile, Republicans started imagining that Federalists, were basically traitors. They wanted the British Empire back. They supported monarchy. They were going to crush all democratic opposition, install a monarch, and bring the British Empire back in the United States. So you have these conspiracy theories going between Republicans and Federalists, and this was a time in politics that was very acrimonious because you effectively had two different groups in the United States who imagined the country and the future of the country in two very different ways. One group that imagines it as a urbanized, capitalistic place of cities and hierarchy, and another group that imagines it as a sort of a rural paradise with farmers and stuff like that. And these sort of imaginations also hid who these people were, right? So you had a lot of Federalists who were, New England shopkeepers, people who were very Protestant, who very much supported more federal government regulation. Um, and you had a lot of Republicans who were not only small farmers, but were actually plantation owners as well, and people who wanted to basically just export their cash crops and not have federal government interference and taxes eating into those potential profits. So the revolutionary rhetoric of the American Revolution, and then especially of the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, greatly impact other people throughout the world. And so one group of people that takes notice of this are enslaved Africans who are working incredibly harsh, forced into incredibly harsh labor, working on sugar and coffee plantations in Haiti, and are enslaved in mass by French white plantation owners in Haiti. And so enslaved Africans begin sort of noticing when your average French people start arguing for the rights of everyone, right, and in equality for all, and um, and they pick up on this rhetoric and they say again, like enslaved peoples in during the American Revolution, and say, why not us? If you are calling for the equality of all people, then you have to end slavery and you have to free us. And so that begins a huge rebellion against French colonial slavery in Haiti around 1790 and 1791, and going up until the early 1800s, 1803, 1804, roughly. And so this we don't have time to discuss this large revolution, but the impact of this revolution is incredible. Because this is the first Black Republic that is created, where enslaved peoples do successfully rebel against slavery and destroy slavery as an institution and bring equality to a formerly enslaved place. And so by 1803, 1804, Haiti has been established as a new republic in the Western Hemisphere, and a republic that has abolished slavery and where enslaved people are now have political power and independence from France. And this was no small feat. These groups of Haitian revolutionaries fought off a 42,000-man army sent by Napoleon Bonaparte around 1800. And this army, which was meant to reconquer Haiti and to bring it back as a French colony, completely fails and is actually beaten in multiple battles, and yellow fever kills many of the members of the expedition. And economically, this was incredibly important because before the Haitian Revolution, Haiti produced 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of all the sugar that was exported to Britain and France. So Haiti was an incredibly important colony to France. But this rebellion that destroys slavery and destroys French colonial rule, greatly impacts the new French revolutionary government under Napoleon. And so the question of Haiti actually gets debated in the United States. And so Federalists like George Washington and especially John Adams actually support Haiti, and they support the Haitian Revolution. They see Haiti as a new democratic government that could be an ally of the United States against monarchy and against empire. And so even though this is a Black republic controlled by people who were formerly enslaved, sort of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, to their credit, see this as a potential ally of the United States. However, there are many Americans who are really bothered by this because remember, slavery is still a major institution in places like Virginia and South Carolina. So white enslavers and plantation owners are freaked out by the Haitian Revolution. They are worried that the example of a successful revolution against slavery is going to lead to enslaved peoples in South Carolina and Virginia revolting against slavery and abolishing it, and taking revenge on the people who enslaved them. And in fact, there are actually a few supposed plots for a rebellion. So Gabriel's rebellion was one of those in 1802. It's possible, though, those plots actually were sort of imaginations of white planters, that there actually didn't even really exist. However, the important thing is that after the Haitian Revolution, white enslavers in Virginia and South Carolina are freaked out by this revolution. And so when these people gain political power in the United States through Thomas Jefferson, who was a Virginian, who was a plantation owner and an enslaver who has enslaved dozens of people. Jefferson reverses U.S. support and diplomatic recognition for Haiti. And the United States will actually not recognize Haiti as an independent country until 1862. And this has consequences because Haiti, as a new republic, needs markets to export cash crops to in order for the economy of Haiti to be successful, in order for people to have money and be prosperous, right? And Europe economically boycotts Haiti. France asks for reparations from Haiti for the destruction of plantations and forces Haiti to actually submit to debt to pay France debt. Um, and the United States refuses to trade Haiti because they don't recognize it as a country. And so what this means is that the sort of debt that the Republic of Haiti owes to France for abolishing slavery again um, is something that they're forced to pay. If they had support from the United States and diplomatic recognition from the United States and regular trade from the United States, the Haitian economy might have actually been a lot more successful. But debt to France and this sort of economic embargo cripples the Haiti as a country, and is probably one of the main reasons why Haiti today has significantly less economic growth than other nations in the Caribbean and Central America. So this debate in the United States between whether to support Haiti as an independent republic or to ostracize them due to the threat to U.S. slavery as an institution, that debate matters, and it mattered greatly to the country of Haiti. So in 1811 and 1812, these sort of tensions that the United States is going through between figuring out whether they're going to be more pro-British or pro-French kind of boil over, and a war breaks out between the United States and Great Britain. And this is part of a larger conflict in Europe. So this is during the Napoleonic era, where um, revolutionary France is successfully conquering a good portion of Europe, and Britain stands as its sort of major enemy. And the United States gets drawn into this conflict as the French demand that the U.S. stop trading with Britain, the British demand that the French stop trading with the United States, and the British Navy starts showing up on the coast of America, and in one particular notorious case, actually it tries to impress forcefully abduct American citizens and force them to be a part of and conscript them into the British Navy. And this is basically a massive violation of United States sovereignty, and the U.S. under the Democratic Republican President James Madison, who's more the part of a party that supports the French a little bit more, ends up declaring war against Great Britain. And again, this is a war that we don't necessarily need to go on the blows of. The important things to note from it is the United States attempts to invade Canada fails again. This is something that will never happen. But during the time of the early republic, they kept thinking that if they could gain control of Canada, they could become a much more sort of powerful country, and that Canadians would be more willing to support the United States. They never really are. This famously leads to the burning of Washington, the new capital that was created between Virginia and Maryland. Um, and the sort of escape of Washington as the White House, the newly created White House, built by enslaved labor, is burnt down by a British army. However, the U.S. military is actually able to be successful in a few battles against Britain, which is fighting again this multi-front war against Napoleonic France. And the sort of important consequences of the War of 1812 is the what it does in terms of national unity. Many historians kind of argued that before the War of 1812, people are living in the United States but aren't thinking of themselves as American. Their identity is first to their state, and then maybe, yeah, we're part of this larger confederation called the United States, right? But it's really with the War of 1812 that people start to think of themselves as an American, and this forges an American identity. So the Star Spangled Banner is quite famously written during this time when an American prisoner on a British ship sees the American flag still standing at Fort McHenry after a British naval bombardment tried to destroy this fort. And so, that our national anthem comes from this period in time. The other thing that this war does is it leads to the United States firmly controlling Ohio, as quite famously Tecumseh starts another forges the same sorts of alliances that were forged by the Lenape and the Miami and the Shawnee in the 1790s, and attempts to again try to secure Native American independence in Ohio, and mostly fails, as the he with a combined British force in modern day Canada loses a major battle on the Thames River in modern day Ontario, and Tecumseh is actually killed. And so this leads to the United States really controlling the state of Ohio, and forming it into a new state. And so the War of 1812 is sort of very important for the creation of American national identity, and the creation of a unified nation that has its own cultural heritage. And so that will sort of conclude this very sprawling lecture looking at the early republic. As you can tell, full lots of stuff happening, and if you want to be inclusive of the history of slavery as an institution and the history of Native nations, this history gets even more sprawling. So again, thank you for making it to this point in the lecture. For our next time, we're going to look at the history of slavery in the 1800s and how slavery actually changes in some prominent ways as an institution. And we will look at the history of Andrew Jackson and how Andrew Jackson revolutionized American politics, and also sort of pushes the boundaries of what the First Republic was politically, as sort of the United States becomes more settler colonial in nature and more tied to the institution of slavery. And slavery as an institution actually has some very important effects on the American political system. We're going to look at those in a little bit more detail for the last lecture of Unit 3, and hopefully set us up in a good state to look at how slavery as an institution ends up causing the Civil War in Unit 4. So thank you very much for your time, and that will be all for today.